Hi guys, today I am talking about the tragic story of Devonte Hart. I know a lot of people have already covered this, but I am going to be moving into speaking only about adopted, foster, and other children in the system and crimes that have happened to them. I have told a bit of my own story. I will continue to do so. I have published 2 books, one about my childhood and a second one that is about my life as an adult and how I chose to change my life after everything that happened to and around me. So without further ado, I would like to speak on the story of Devonte Hart and how him and his siblings, some of his siblings, were murdered by their adoptive mother. In 2014, a photo went viral, and I will be speaking about that and showing the photos as we go through. So this photo went viral. In 2014, a photo of Devonte Hart hugging a police officer during a Black Lives Matter protest went instantly viral. Just 4 years later, he made headlines again, but this time for a tragic reason. The Devonte Hart photo was indeed captivating. It featured a young black boy in tears embracing a white police officer amid racial unrest. But then, 4 years later, he was killed in a murder-suicide orchestrated by his adoptive mother. In 2018, Hart's whole family was driven off of a 100-foot cliff in California by their intoxicated matriarch. She was not intoxicated. Guys, this is debunked in the police records. During the investigation of his death, allegations of years of abuse by his parents, a white lesbian couple, came to light. This evidence begged the question, could Devonte Hart's death have been avoided? Though his body was never found, Devonte Hart was declared dead, and this is his tragic story. Okay, so there's a lot of his story. It goes into, we're going to go, so that is one article about it. This was written by allthatisinteresting.com. Before his hopeful adoption spiraled into a cycle of abuse, Devonte Hart had experienced a rough childhood in Texas. He was the second of 4 siblings, Dante the eldest, Jeremiah, and Sierra. His biological mother struggled, and I'm not going to talk about why she struggled, but she did end up losing her parental rights in 2006. The siblings were placed under the care of an aunt and then removed after a caseworker found that the aunt had the mother babysitting the children. Now, it's not clear what the actual legality of that was. However, it does seem like a loophole to have the children removed from my research. Although the children's aunt fought to keep them, it was too late. Devonte, Jeremiah, and Sierra were adopted in 2008. 2 years is pretty fast for an adoption, by Jennifer and Sarah Hart, a white couple from Minnesota. Dante was left behind and forced into the state's child welfare system instead. That was the last little hope I had in my life, you know. I had that hope that I was going to see my little brothers again, and one day we were going to kick it, Dante said after hearing the news of his sibling's tragic death in 2018. I used to cry sometimes thinking that what we could be doing growing up. The Hart family hid a lot of disturbing truths in plain sight. Devonte and his siblings joined an already large family. Jennifer and Sarah had adopted another set of siblings, Marquise, Hannah, and Abigail, in 2006. The family of 8 frequently traveled to music festivals across the country. Devonte Hart often held a sign that said "free hugs" and wore a zebra bodysuit. He ended up in the newspaper a lot because Jennifer often shared all of these photos to social media. In 2013, the photo of him hugging a police officer went viral, and it said, "This kid, his dancing, his smile, and free hugs, his love of life is just contagious." It was captivated. That was what was posted on, that is what was eventually posted on Facebook by Jennifer with the photo of him hugging the police officer. The police officer later said that he asked for help, but he didn't know what he was talking about. Later that year, Devonte Hart's photo from the Portland demonstrations went viral. It was a hopeful image taken amid protests over the police shootings of a black teenager named Michael Brown. Jennifer wrote more about her family as Black Lives Matter protests swept the country. "I've been struggling with the color blindness I'm surrounded by in my circle of friends. My children are black," she wrote. But what the family posted on social media obscured a disturbing truth. According to people who knew the family, their home life was filled with emotional and physical abuse. The children were reportedly scared to death of Jen. They had to raise their hands before they spoke and were punished for laughing at the dinner table. The children complained on multiple occasions to their public school teachers in Minnesota and then Woodland, Washington when they moved there. They were starving. Jennifer and Sarah would allegedly withhold food from them as a punishment. The children were worryingly thin. A close friend of Jennifer recalled once mistaking Hannah, then 14, for a 7 or 8-year-old. Jennifer claimed that the children were thin because their biological families, and she maintained that they had been starved and abused before she adopted them and that it had affected their growth. This is really common with abusive parents, especially abusive adoptive parents. Hart also claimed that Devonte Hart was born with drugs pumping through his newborn body, also pretty common, and that by the time he was 4, he had been shot at, an account that pushed racist stereotypes about poor black families and was denied by lawyers of Devonte Hart's aunt and mother. So she lied to the people in her circle, but she also lied to the children and told them that their life before her was far worse than it actually was. On March 26th of 2018, Jennifer Hart drove her gold SUV off of a 100-foot cliff in California with her whole family in tow. Authorities were met with a gruesome scene as the bodies of Jennifer, Sarah, and 3 of their adopted children, Marquise, Abigail, and Jeremiah, were found in the car. The other 3 children, including Devonte, had been ejected from the vehicle. Eventually, investigators found the remains of Sierra and Hannah, but Devonte Hart was never recovered and was declared dead in 2019. He was 15 at the time. Jennifer Hart's motives remain unknown, but authorities discovered that her blood alcohol levels did exceed the legal limit. Authorities also found that Sarah Hart and at least one of the children had Benadryl in their systems. Damningly, internet searches on Sarah Hart's phone included questions like, "What over-the-counter medications can you take to overdose, and is death by drowning relatively painless?" Given this evidence, it does appear that the Hart family crash had been deliberate, and investigators believe that Jennifer got herself drunk in order to build up the courage to kill them all. Some of those who knew the Harts believe that Jennifer had committed the murder-suicide because of the child abuse reports that followed her. As one investigator put it, "My feeling is based on talking to witnesses. They felt that if they couldn't have those kids, then no one was going to have them." There's a lot more that goes into this. I will be looking for the CPS reports to show you guys as well. So that's one. And all the resources I use will be linked below. With its soaring cliffs and expansive horizons, the Pacific coastline of Mendocino, California is exactly the type of place Jennifer Hart may have chosen for a photo op. But on March 26th of 2018, the image-conscious mother did not line up her half-dozen kids for a trademark artistic shot. Instead, she drove the family SUV over the edge, killing the children, herself, and her wife. Having 6 people die like that made it the largest mass murder in our country in modern times, said retired Mendocino Sheriff Tom Allman of the shocking crime, adding that the adult deaths were classified as suicides. Now, as a new documentary, Broken Hearts is the documentary, if you want to look at it, has decoded Jen's carefully curated Facebook posts and exposed the executioner as an abusive narcissist who hid behind a woke facade. Yeah, I think. In November of 2014, a picture of one of the children, then 12-year-old Devonte Hart, went viral as an iconic symbol of racial harmony. Devonte was the weeping black boy shown hugging the white cop in a seemingly spontaneous gesture at a protest against police brutality in Portland, Oregon. Commenting on live TV shortly after the image was taken, NBC News anchor Brian Willard gushed, "What the world needs right now might be just what we see in this photo." But as investigative journalist Zarin Baum told the Post, these mothers used Devonte and his siblings as performing monkeys for traffic potential. There were accessories to a lifestyle Jen and Sarah wanted to portray on social media, and the likes were dopamine. The pair started their family in 2006. I will say that they had foster kids before this that do speak out as well. In Alexandria, Minnesota, home to the adoptive children Marquise, Hannah, and Abigail. In 2009, Devonte and his siblings Jeremiah and Sierra joined the household. Now, if you notice, these dates are a little different than the other report. However, this is from New York Post, so it's probably a little more accurate. All children of color, the 6 kids came from Harris County, Texas, after being removed from their biological parents. There is so much to this case, guys. So much. So Jen was a huge avid photographer. She took these pictures of her children. They were so carefully curated. Her posts were so carefully curated. It reminds me of someone I knew. And it is really, really frustrating to see these same narcissistic traits play out and not see social media as a red flag. I know that CPS cannot investigate solely on what is portrayed on social media. However, it goes to note that many people with narcissistic traits and tendencies tend to post to their social media in a very particular and curated way. So I do want to point that out as my own little side note. These 2 white lesbians did go on to have all children of color, and they said, if not us, who, about adopting them. As if people of color who adopt aren't good enough? I don't know. According to clinical and forensic psychologist Dr. Joni Johnston, Jen's virtue signaling did not seem right. Featured on Broken Hearts, the expert says, on the surface it looks like, oh, it's all about my kid. But beneath the lines, there's just this constant theme that if it wasn't for us, this kid would have ended up who knows where. Which, within the adoption community, that is such a huge narrative that children are fed, but especially children that are born to parents who have either drug addiction, poverty issues, etc. Now, if you want to know about the biological mother of these children, it is not hard to find. This information is everywhere. However, I will encourage you to not do that, and even more so to not shame this biological mother. She has lost her children in a very, very tragic way for the second time. Many birth mothers hold on to the hope that one day their children will reach out and find them and get to know the true story, or at least their side of the story that contributes to the child's story. In this case, that will never happen, and it is sad and tragic that it will never happen. The selfishness of some adoptive parents is very evident. However, I highly push that state agencies and social workers, if you see this video, please take into account what children are truly going through, and how social media and the posts posted by adoptive and foster parents may play a role in figuring out the psychology of these people. Friends of Jin's did come out and say, in hindsight, it definitely looks like they were painting themselves as heroes and these children as very, very sad victims that needed to be rescued. Yes, that's very common. That is very common within the adoptive parent community. In truth, these parents needed rescuing from their adoptive moms. Despite repeated complaints to Child Protective Services about suspected abuse, the pair retained custody. Concerned parties in the state of Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington, the family was somewhat nomadic, reported domestic violence and a culture of reward and punishment and the withholding of food. Very little was done. This is true. There are multiple reports on these children, and in many cases there are. However, within the social work and adoption community, I want to point out that due to the culture of demonizing biological parents and glorifying adoptive parents, oftentimes adopted children and sometimes even foster children who come forward with allegations and about abuse within their home are told that they're just not grateful, and then are diagnosed with things like reactive attachment disorder or other attachment disorders. And oftentimes they're acting out, even though they're acting out for help in their current situation, can be misinterpreted and tied back to previous situations. I'm truly calling for a change within the system, and this story truly demonstrates how many agencies truly failed all of these children, and how well a narcissist may be, or a suspected narcissist may be able to act in a particular situation to look like the good guy, when in actuality they may be tormenting their children. In 2010, the outwardly mild-mannered Sarah was convicted of a misdemeanor domestic assault against Abigail, who was 6 at the time. Sarah's punishment was a year of community service as well as probation, merely a slap on the wrist. The unwelcomed attention, nevertheless, spooked the moms and caused them to homeschool their children. This is because the daughter disclosed abuse and medical malpractice. They were not being taken to the doctor, and the child had been beaten repeatedly with, I believe it was a belt, but I don't remember specifically, but it was a foreign object, and it was, it was bad enough to where she ended up in the ER. And while Sarah took the charge, it is actually, one of the theories is that Jen was the dominating partner and was also perpetrating domestic abuse against Sarah. So she manipulated Sarah to take the charge, given that Sarah did not have a history of violence where Jennifer did. So even though the child named Jennifer as her abuser, Sarah took that charge. But Sarah's former co-worker, Deanne Drystald, who also appears in the 90-minute film, is convinced her colleague took the blame for the assault to protect the real perpetrator, who was Jennifer. Sarah told me she had spanked Abigail not too hard, and there were bruises, and the police were involved. Drystad recalls on camera, "I was surprised and disappointed. There was something, I guess, that I felt it just seemed a bit off, and my gut instinct right away was that, oh my goodness, she's covering for Jen." This is a common theme in domestic relationships with narcissists. Even if you're the one being abused, sometimes you end up being the one who is apologizing. Not just narcissists, sometimes just in toxic relationships as well. So not saying that Jen is a narcissist, because she's dead. There's no way to really diagnose that at this point. However, she did have narcissistic traits and was definitely a toxic partner as well as a toxic parent who ended up taking the lives of her children. Such alarming red flags never made it onto YouTube or Facebook. The couple's adoring followers could instead delight in the undersized kids offering their free hugs and hippie music festivals, and also their political rallies for Bernie Sanders. He doesn't have anything to do with this. They just happen to be at the political rally. Guys, please don't run with that. The Hart family peaked with the release of the AP photograph of Devontae and the police officer. It attracted millions of views online. Her children knew that they had to go along with this stuff, said Burnett. The fact we can see smiling photos of them is easy to fake. Yeah, it is. Like any circus animal, they had to perform while the crowds were there, so they could later be allowed to eat, sleep, and have all the basic necessities that any child would expect. At the time, Sarah, who was described in CPS reports as being cold towards the kids, seemed complicit. However, Cheryl Hart, with no relation, who worked with Sarah at the Kohl's store at the time of her death, told the documentary that her colleague once confided in her about Jen's demanding, obsessive behaviors. She said, "I think Sarah was the buffer between her kids and Jen, like a battered spouse would be." Again, that does seem very realistic. In my life, I was raised by lesbian parents. One of them was very domineering, very toxic, very abusive, and she would batter the other one. So much so that one of my parents actually had a horrific health incident happen that was caused by stress that the other parent had put on her. And it's just, and that's just one story. So as much as I can sympathize with Sarah in this situation, I know in my situation, when enough was enough, when she had seen enough, my mom stood up and said, absolutely not. In this case, Sarah never stood up and never said, no, I'm not the one hitting the kids. Jennifer is. No, I'm not the one hurting them. Jennifer is. And if you are in a situation where your partner is hurting your children, your responsibility as a parent is to say, absolutely not. This is not okay. And get your kids to safety. That is your responsibility. Whether those kids are foster care, adopted, or biologically yours, your job as a parent, as a parental figure, is to protect those children at all costs, at any cost. If I found out that my ex-husband was harming my child, I would take my child and I would leave the state. Then I would file paperwork. Understand that I don't care if I go to jail. I have proof of abuse and I am filing that paperwork and I am getting my child to safety that exact minute. That is how we are supposed to be as parents. As parents, we make a commitment, whether it's the minute we get pregnant, whether it's the minute we give birth, however you see that, whether it is the minute you decide, I want to be a foster parent, you make a commitment to protect the children within your home. If you make the decision to sign legal documentation saying these children are your responsibility, even more so, those are your responsibility. It's your responsibility to protect them, to feed them, to clothe them, to house them. Those aren't things that children should be begging for or asking for. Those are things you commit to from the jump. Your job as a parent is to protect, feed, clothe, house your children. Now, on top of that, protection falls into multiple categories: psychological, physical, emotional, abuse. Those are still classifications that we as parents make a commitment as soon as we become parents to protect our children from. That is my rant. That is my rant. Meanwhile, the net closed on the ringmaster Jennifer after she took her traveling show to a new home in Woodland, Washington in 2017. Within months, the increasingly desperate kids, led by Devontae, begged for food and disclosed the abuse to the neighbors next door. The horrified neighbors alerted CPS, but attempts by social workers to investigate were thwarted by the parents. Apparently terrified of the ensuing scandal, they packed up the family for their final road trip in the early hours of March 2016. March 26th of 2018. In my heart, I believe the mission was death, Sheriff Allman said in the documentary. There was a one-way journey as soon as they left. The bodies of Jen and Sarah, who were both 38, along with Marquise 19, Abigail 14, Jeremiah 14, and Sierra 12, were all found in or near their vehicle after the 100-foot plunge. The remains of Hannah 16 washed ashore weeks later, but Devontae was never located. It's one of my greatest regrets as a sheriff that Devontae's body could not be recovered for his blood relatives, concludes Allman. The best theory we have is that he was taken directly out into the ocean. Devontae's tears may have been interpreted by social media as a beacon of hope, but in the end, they truly masked a far darker reality. Okay, let's see if I can get the, public records. We're gonna pull some public records here. Okay, I don't want to, okay, so this is the Ukiah Journal. I don't want to do that. Okay. Okay, so Mendocino County Coroner's Inquest reveals new details in the Hart family crash. Willits, the two mothers killed on the northern Mendocino coast last year in a car crash that also took the lives of their 6 children. Both were intoxicated. The driver legally drunk and her wife in the passenger seat with an excess level of antihistamine in her system. A doctor who performed their autopsies told the jury. Jennifer Hart, the driver of the GMC Yukon that careened over the side of a 100-foot cliff near Westport a year ago, had a blood alcohol level of 0.10, said Dr. Greg B. Pizzario, a forensic pathologist. Sarah Hart, the passenger, had in her bloodstream a toxic level of dihentamethrin, the active ingredient in the antihistamine Benadryl, which also acts as a sedative and is sometimes used to induce sleep. The same was true for at least 3 of their children, Marquise 19 and Abigail and Jeremiah, both 14, whose bodies were recovered in the wreckage. Though they had far less antihistamine in their systems than their mother, it was still well above the therapeutic level in all cases. He said their head injuries from the crash were severe and would have killed them within seconds. The doctor's testimony came during the first day of the coroner's inquest into the March 2018 incident that stunned the North Coast and the nation. The disappearance of an entire family from southern Washington state and their mysterious end, discovered days later in the gruesome car wreck that Mendocino County Sheriff Tom Allman quickly ruled out as an accident. "I'm calling it a crime," he had said a year ago this week. Sheriff's investigators could find no evidence of skid marks on the cliff where the SUV went over. Allman convened the rare coroner's inquest, the first since 1967 in the country, to determine, if possible, whether the deaths of the 2 women and their children, ages 12 to 19, were accidental or a murder-suicide. Allman said he felt compelled to try to put out some kind of closure on what happened to the Hart family, and especially the children, all African American who were adopted from Texas. Their time with Jennifer and Sarah Hart included a series of abrupt moves and suspicions from school officials and formal investigations by child welfare authorities. At their last home in rural Woodland, Washington, they left in the SUV a day after Child Protective Services representatives showed up at their doorstep, responding to a concerned report from the next-door neighbors. This This happened in Texas and Minnesota and Oregon and Washington and here. Nobody was going to find out how this happened, why this happened. If we don't do it, who would? Allman said in an interview. Investigative findings expected to be detailed in court on Thursday show, according to the sheriff's office, that the vehicle was at a dead stop before Jennifer Hart began accelerating towards the edge of the highway pullout. But Allman has arranged for jurors to provide the final word on whether she deliberately drove her family off a cliff, and if so, whether she did it with the agreement of her wife or whether neither intended to die that day. It talks about how they were found. One CHP officer testified Wednesday about his puzzlement over the absence of tire or skid marks on the site crash. Officer Michael Covington, who patrols the coastline, says he has seen a fair number of crashes, and it was very unusual to see no indication or evidence of any kind to indicate why the car went off the cliff. He and other law enforcement officers on the scene described hours of work in the fading light of March 2016 to recover the smashed Yukon and the two people inside. Sarah Hart, who was squeezed between the roof and the passenger area, and Jennifer Hart, whose body slid out of the vehicle onto the rocks. Below, the SUV was pulled up and the side of the cliff around midnight, more than 8 hours after it was first seen by a German tourist. Pizarro said Jennifer Hart was the only one whose injuries suggested she had been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. Oh, she wanted to survive. Much of what was touched on in court has already been disclosed by authorities, part of the larger, widely ranged saga of two moms who adopted two sets of black siblings out of foster care in Texas between 2006 and 2009 and moved them to rural Alexandria, Minnesota. After a few years, they found themselves being questioned about their disciplinary techniques after two of the girls told the school office about bruising and corporal punishment, and after one, Abigail, showed up to first grade with bruises on her abdomen and her back. Abigail identified Jennifer Hart as responsible, but Sarah Hart pled guilty to the misdemeanor of domestic abuse, and soon after, the children were withdrawn from school, and the Hart family later moved to Portland, Oregon area, where by 2013, they were again under investigation by Child Protective Services. By 2017, they had moved to Woodland, where within a few months, neighbors Bruce and Dana Kabab received a troubling visit in the middle of the night from Hannah Hart, who begged them to hide her and protect her from her parents. The Kabab said in an interview, next it was her brother Devontae who sought help, asking for food first for himself and then for his siblings, with increasing frequency over a couple of days in the weeks before the tragedy. On March 23rd, they called Child Protective Services, who sent a representative that day. The official arrived in the Hart house minutes after Jennifer Hart's gold Yukon drove up the driveway. A Clark County, Washington sheriff's detective testified. But when CPS workers knocked on the Hart's door, no one answered, so she left a card stuck in the doorway. By the next day, the Yukon was gone, and a dozen cinder blocks from the end of the wall at the edge of their driveway apparently knocked free in their hasty departure. Earlier in the morning, Sarah Hart, a Kohl's department store manager, had texted her coworker to say that she was too ill to come to work. The day after that, authorities would later learn Jennifer Hart walked into Fort Bragg Safeway on her own, made a few small purchases, and left. The next day, following another failed attempt by Child Protective Services to reach the family, a deputy was called twice to check the residence. A coworker of Sarah Hart's had asked for the welfare check, given how unusual it was for her store manager to be out of touch. Inside of the house, authorities found milk in the refrigerator that had been recently purchased, luggage left in the garbage, and toothbrushes in their regular spots. Several pets, including ducks and possibly a cat, remained at the house. A short time later that day, the German tourist visiting Mendocino Coast looked over a steep cliff and saw the family's crumpled SUV below. So basically, that is what it was. Yeah. That was what led up to the death of 6 children and 2 adults, one who obviously had narcissistic tendencies. And yeah, so I think the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open Facebook, and I'm going to look at Jennifer Hart's page because I think that that is just so telling. Is this it? No. Jennifer Hart. Nope. I'm looking for this specific people. That's not it. Okay. I can no longer find this information. I think it's like Hart family something, actually. Okay, so here's the case discussion page. It's all locked down though. Again, that's a private group. I can't find it. All right.